Welcome back, everyone. So we are in part 3 of our topic 2 textbook. So we're going to move on into taking a look at how did eukaryotes develop. So we've already talked about what constitutes life and the difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So now we're going to see, how did we go from a very simple cell, a prokaryotic cell, how did we, end up with this more complex eukaryotic cell? And then from there get, these complex plants, animals, fungi, and so forth. So by the end of this video, you should be able to describe the endosymbiotic theory. So we'll go into detail about that theory and explain the origin of mitochondria and chloroplasts. So mitochondria and chloroplasts will actually, those are two organelles found inside the eukaryotic cell. And we'll go more into detail of those two organelles in a future video. Actually, it's the next video on the components of eukaryotic cells. But we'll go ahead and just kind of describe their origin first and then learn about them later. Okay? And as always, good idea to write these down, and then at the end of the video, be able to describe them from memory. So let's start out by talking about how did eukaryotes develop. So I took this picture from, I think it was way back in topic 1. So basically, thinking about the history of life. So we know that life began in the ocean, and we think that it originated about 3.5 billion years ago. So billion with a B. And we think the first living things were, of course, microorganisms, and they were prokaryotic cells. So of course we learned about in the last video that prokaryotic cells are very small and simple. They lack a nucleus. They basically just have the 4 components of a cell: the cell membrane, the cytoplasm, the ribosomes, and the DNA. And then they might have some extra stuff like the cell wall and so forth. But that's about it. And so they're very simple creatures, very simple organisms. So we think they were the first living things on our Earth, and they originated about 3.5 billion years ago. And then from there, we start seeing the first, what we think are photosynthetic prokaryotes form. So photosynthetic meaning that they can basically convert energy from the sun into a usable form. So they can take inorganic molecules, so carbon dioxide and water, and convert it into something that they can actually use, a chemical form of energy. And so those started to develop, such as our cyanobacteria that we can see here. So something like, these green cyanobacteria that we can see may have started to form. Actually, this is algae, but imagine something like that forming. Were the first photosynthetic prokaryotes that formed. And when that happened, well, if you think of plants, what is a byproduct of photosynthesis? So if plants take in carbon dioxide and water, they make sugar from it, but what is a byproduct of that? What do they expel? Well, they breathe out oxygen. So you can think of these prokaryotes, these photosynthetic prokaryotes, they're starting to produce oxygen. And so, early Earth was anaerobic, and so the first prokaryotes were anaerobic. They didn't need oxygen to survive. It was actually toxic to them. And so as we had these photosynthetic prokaryotes in early Earth, in 3.5 billion years ago to 2 billion years ago, they started to pump more oxygen into the atmosphere. And so that caused the death of a lot of our anaerobic prokaryotes. So they started to die off, and then we started to see more aerobic prokaryotes expand. So those that could survive in oxygen-rich environments. So, we kind of transition from the anaerobic prokaryotes to the aerobic prokaryotes. And then from there, we start seeing about 2.1 billion years ago, the first eukaryotes emerge. So the first eukaryotic cells emerge. So this is just kind of like a timeline of our Earth's history. So the Earth, we think, formed about 4.6 billion years ago. Life began about 3.5 billion years ago, and then the first eukaryotic cells about 2.1 billion years ago. So, of course, we think that the first signs of life were prokaryotic, but how did we end up with eukaryotic cells? So we think that it came from basically one prokaryotic cell engulfing another and somehow evolving together to live together. So that is called the endosymbiosis theory. So think of endo meaning within, and symbiotic, think, together or, benefiting off of each other. So the within evolving together theory. So we think that the eukaryotes are the product of one prokaryote engulfing another. Instead of just digesting the other prokaryote, it evolved together. So you can kind of see here was our early, some sort of prokaryote back then. And then it somehow engulfed an aerobic bacterium. And then that aerobic bacterium, instead of just dying, being digested or eaten, it somehow survived, and it evolved, over time, many generations. Somehow it started becoming part of the cell into what we know as today the mitochondrion. And we also think the same thing happened with the origin of the chloroplast. We think the chloroplast was once a photosynthetic prokaryote. So, we think that same thing happened is where we had some sort of photosynthetic bacterium somehow got engulfed by some prokaryote, or maybe it was an early eukaryote, we don't know, and it got engulfed by that early eukaryote or prokaryote and somehow survived and over time evolved into a chloroplast. So this is the endosymbiosis theory. Okay. Now, of course, endosymbiosis theories is a scientific theory, so we have to have a lot of evidence, broad-based evidence, to support this theory. So what is the evidence to support it? So let's take a look at our mitochondria. So our mitochondria, first of all, it is about 1 to 10 micrometers in length. Now, if we recall with the size of our prokaryotes, how big are our prokaryotes? They range about the same size, right? So they're about 0.5 to 5 micrometers. So they land in about the same range in size as our mitochondria. So hey, they are about the same size as prokaryotes. Also, mitochondria divide independently compared to the eukaryotic cells. So when eukaryotic cells divide, and we'll learn more about mitosis later on in the term, but when our animal cells, when our eukaryotic cells divide, they divide a certain way, but within the eukaryotic cells, the mitochondria, they divide independently of that. And the way they divide is very similar to the way prokaryotic cells divide. So prokaryotes, they divide via a special process called binary fission. And we'll learn more about binary fission when we study that later on. So mitochondria, when they divide, it looks just like how prokaryotes divide their cells. So hey, there's some evidence to support that endosymbiotic theory. Also, bacterial cells, mitochondria, they resemble bacterial cells. So they actually look like, they have these kind of folds, we call these little folds cristae. So it actually looks like, it's two membranes. We have an inner membrane and then this outer membrane. So it looks like we have inner membrane could be one organism that was engulfed by the other one. So here's the other membrane from the engulfing of the other. So that is also some more evidence to support this endosymbiotic theory. So it's shaped like a specific group of bacteria that was, surrounded, and it's surrounded by a double membrane, so it was engulfed. And then the, outer, the cristae, the inner folds here do resemble the surface of bacteria. If we take a closer look inside of the mitochondria, and we'll learn more about this when we, in the next video, they actually have circular DNA, a single circular DNA inside. And so that's weird because none of our other organelles have DNA, okay, other than the nucleus that has our entire blueprint, but like the Golgi apparatus doesn't have DNA or anything like that. So why does mitochondria have like a singular circular DNA? So that could, again, be because it was a prokaryotic cell at one point in our evolutionary history. And the DNA that it does possess is similar to the DNA that's expressed in bacteria. So there's some more evidence to support that theory. And then finally, our mitochondria has special ribosomes and transfer RNAs or tRNAs that are similar to what we find in prokaryotes. Okay, so there's even more evidence to support that endosymbiotic theory. So that's quite a bit of evidence to support this idea that mitochondria are basically the result of one prokaryotic cell engulfing another a long time ago. Now we can also say the same thing with chloroplasts. Now first off, chloroplasts are a type of plasmid, and we're not going to really go into detail of that because we're not studying plants. But chloroplasts, they, we think, evolved from some sort of ancient prokaryotic cell, or perhaps a very early eukaryotic cell that engulfed a photosynthetic cyanobacterium. So some sort of bacterium that was photosynthesizing at the time. And so the evidence to support that is, again, our chloroplast has two membranes, two or more membranes. So just like the mitochondria has two membranes. So we think that the first membrane surrounded the cyanobacterium, and then the second membrane was from the engulfing prokaryote. We also see the evidence of having its own DNA. Okay, so the genome is just a fancy word for the DNA, or the entire genetic code. So there is a piece of DNA, or a circular DNA, found inside the chloroplast. So why does it have that? Okay, so why do chloroplasts have their own DNA? Why do mitochondria have their own DNA? So could it possibly be because this was at one time a photosynthetic cyanobacterium? And then just like the mitochondrium, chloroplasts, they divide like prokaryotes. Okay, so they divide, it looks very similar to binary fission in prokaryotic cells. Okay. And then if we take a closer look at the chloroplast DNA, it looks very similar to cyanobacteria DNA, okay? Particularly when we're looking at red and green algae, their chloroplast DNA looks very, very similar to cyanobacteria, okay? The plant chloroplast DNA is a little bit different just because it's, evolved further along. But red and green algae, we think directly descended from cyanobacteria. All right. So there's even more evidence to support that endosymbiosis theory. All right, so here is a review question. So mitochondria most likely evolved from, was it aerobic bacteria, a photosynthetic cyanobacteria, cytoskeletal elements, or membrane proliferation? If you chose aerobic bacteria, I would agree with you. So remember, aerobic means with oxygen. So some sort of bacterium that used oxygen was engulfed by another prokaryote and evolved into our mitochondria. Okay, for chloroplasts, we think it was a photosynthetic cyanobacterium. All right, so that's it for our third part of topic 2, how did eukaryotes develop? So by now you should be able to describe endosymbiotic theory, as well as explain the origin of mitochondria and chloroplasts. So for our next video, we'll learn more about mitochondria and chloroplasts with the components of eukaryotic cells, as well as all the other organelles found within our eukaryotic cells. Okay.